So we know the American Revolution was whenever that it is the United States now. The United States citizens wanted to break free and gain their freedom from the British king, and they did exactly that. So we know all that because we are the United States now. We no longer are ran by the British. And I wanted to spice things up a little bit, do something a little bit different. So I ordered us the I Survived the American Revolution book. And I wanted us to have, I know it's a secondary source, he was not there. This is Nathaniel Fox, and he was not there during the American Revolution. So it's not a true story, but it kind of will put us in a mindset of how that somebody would have faced these battles being in the American Revolution during that time. So we're going to read this book. I'm going to read a few chapters a day, and you'll have like a short quiz or some questions over it every day. But it's just a little something different, so bear with me. And if you have any questions at all, y'all know to message me, okay? So remember, the American Revolution took place in the Americas, and these people were fighting tooth and nail, and they lost some battles, they won some battles to break free from King George because of all the things that he was a butthole. So we had to look at all the things that they did to get there and the different battles. The main thing I want you to realize is that the American Revolution was not one big fight and over. It was multiple battles, and that's how war is made up. It is not just a bunch of people boxing and fighting, okay? All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to start reading with chapter 1. So here's the picture. All right, chapter 1, August 29th, 1776, Brooklyn, New York. Nathaniel Fox was too young to be fighting in the Revolutionary War. He was only 11 years old, but here he was on a blood-soaked battlefield in Brooklyn, New York. Thousands of British soldiers were on the attack, and Nate was sure that he was about to die. Gunfire crackled through the air. Crack! Cannons and blasts shook the ground. Kaboom! Already one of Nate's friends was laying dead in the dirt, shot through the heart. And now Nate was running for his life. He tore through the thick forest, dodging trees and stumbling over the rocks. His mind swirled with fear. Blood pounded his ears, and then he came even more terrifying sound. Heavy footsteps right behind him. Nate whipped his head around in panic. Over his shoulder, and he saw an enormous soldier chasing after him. The man's musket was aimed at Nate's back. Attached to the gun's tip was a killing sword, a bonnet. Nate ran faster, desperate to escape, but he could hear the man's pounding steps and his grunting breath. "I'm not a soldier!" Nate wanted to scream, but it was too late. The man was closing in, closer, closer, closer. Nate braced himself for the killing stab, and he was sure that this was the end. And then came the ear-shattering blast. Boom! Nate saw flames, a blinding light, and then the world went black. Chapter 2. This was 7 weeks earlier. So that was the comic set. This is 7 weeks earlier. July 11th, 1776, noon, in Connecticut. Nate crawled along his uncle's vegetable garden, tugging up weeds and flicking away fat green worms. The burning sun cooked his back. His muscles ached from hours of work. But even worse was the sound of his uncle's voice barking through the open dining room window. His uncle was talking about the war with England. Nate peeked through the window, and his uncle, Uriah Storch, was sitting at the fine wooden table. He was eating his noon meal with his best friend, Mr. Markson. Nate breathed in the delicious food smells, but there was nothing delicious about watching Storch gobble the leg of a roasted goose. Storch pretended to be a gentleman, but Nate had seen hogs with better manners. "George Washington should be hanged," Storch was saying, cracking his poor goose's bone with his large teeth. Just a picture. Looking through the window. This reminds me of my uncle. George Washington was the commander of the American Army. Most people in Connecticut loved General Washington. They called themselves patriots, which meant they were rooting for the Americans to win the war. We know what a patriot is. But Storch and his pal were on England's side. Storch hated George Washington more than he hated the fleas that crawled around his curled white wig. Storch turned towards the kitchen and bellowed, "More meat!" Seconds later, Eliza hurried in carrying a silver platter piled high with fresh goose. Eliza stood patiently while the men heaped food on their plate. She'd been up since dawn cooking this meal, but neither of the men thanked her or even looked at her. Nate hated living here with Storch, but Eliza had it far worse. Nate was his nephew. Eliza was Storch's slave. Nate caught Eliza's eye through the window, and he pushed together his lips and puffed out his cheeks, his best Storch imitation. Eliza raised her eyebrow at Nate, a reminder that he'd better watch himself. Storch was always looking for an excuse to give Nate a whack with his walking stick. He would not be happy to see Nate's blue eyes peering through the window. Nate ducked away. He had hours of work left to do, but he needed a break from the heat. He went to the shady spot under the cherry tree and looked down at the Long Island Sound. He loved watching the ships sailing by. Nate closed his lips and pretended that he was on one of those ships, heading out to the open sea. His mind filled up with the sounds of flapping sails and squawking seagulls. He imagined a cool sea breeze ruffling his hair. He could practically feel his father's strong hand resting on his shoulder. Papa had been a ship's captain. After Nate's mama got sick and died, when Nate was just 4, Papa started taking Nate along with him on his voyages. Nate grew up crisscrossing the ocean with Papa and his crews. What a happy life. Sure, not every kid would want to grow up on the sea. The creaking wooden sailing ships were crawling with rats. The stale wormy biscuits could break your teeth. Nate's bed was a hammock hanging from the ceiling. But none of that mattered, because Nate was with Papa. Nate pictured his father's green eyes flashing from under the old sailing cap, his black ponytail waving in the wind. He'd wrap his arm around Nate's shoulder as they stood on the deck, looking out at the endless ocean. "You never know what's ahead," Papa would say, his eyes brimming with excitement. But now a sound of sadness crashed over Nate. Papa died almost 2 years ago, while they were sailing home from a trip to the Caribbean islands. The voyage had been smooth, with steady winds, a glassy sea, and a crew of 10 men. Nate's favorite crew member was Paul Dobbins, a joking 18-year-old with bright red hair and a gap-toothed grin. He sailed with Papa before, and he had always treated Nate like his favorite brother. They had been halfway through their 3-week voyage home when they sailed into the path of a wicked storm. It came out of nowhere, and a ferocious squall with swirling black clouds, pounding rain, and lightning that tore open the sky. The winds blew like dragon breaths. Waves crashed over the deck. Papa and the crew worked frantically, sliding across the rain-soaked decks and pushing through the whipping winds. Giant, twisting waves spun the ship like a toy. The crew managed to take down the sails, but then a 20-foot wave grabbed hold of Papa and swept him off the deck. In a blink, he was swallowed up by the sea and gone forever. Suddenly, Nate was an orphan, with just one living relative in the world, the uncle that Papa had always hated. Papa had stayed away from Storch, a man as mean as he was rich. Storch was the last person Papa would have wanted Nate to live with, but where else would Nate go? Paul had promised to stay in touch. He hugged Nate tight and he'd sworn he'd always look after him. "We're blood, you and me," he said.
Hi, Mama.
Go get your iPad. But that was just talk. Nate hadn't heard a peep from Paul in 2 years. Okay, sit down. And he hadn't had no idea why. We'll go get the dinosaur in a minute. Nate knew that he should be thankful that Storch gave him a home. Plenty of orphans ended up as beggars. At least Nate had a family to take him in. Except Storch had never treated Nate like family. A stray dog was more like it. It was Eliza who made sure that Nate knew he wasn't alone in the world. Remember, Eliza's the slave. During Nate's first months with Storch, he was tortured by nightmares. He'd wake up and Eliza sitting by his bed. She'd be gripping his hand like she'd just pulled him out of a churning sea. She was Nate's family now. Nate stood there under the cherry tree, his mind swirling with sad memories. He was so distracted. He didn't hear the footsteps creeping up behind him. Something poked his back. A voice cried, "Back to work or I'll chop you." Nate stood very still. "Are you a pirate?" Nate asked. "Yes," the voice said. "A pirate. I want my treasure." Nate's heart lifted up. He whirled around to face his attacker, 3-year-old Theo, Eliza's little boy. He was waving his pirate sword, a spindly stick from the cherry tree. Theo was supposed to be napping and out of Storch's sight, but here he was wide awake. "You are fierce," Nate told his little friend. Theo stood proudly, his brown eyes gleaming like polished gold. He'd been wild about pirates for months now, ever since Nate started telling him stories about his adventures at sea. Theo waved his stick sword. "Arrgh!" he shouted out in his most pirate-like voice. Nate grabbed Theo around the waist and picked him up. Theo's happy giggles rose up, whooshing over Nate like a breeze. Seconds later, Eliza came rushing out of the house, her skirt swirling around her shoes. Eliza had Theo's same dark brown skin and big bright eyes, but unlike Theo, Eliza wasn't smiling. "You both need to hush," she warned, looking out towards the house. "You know what he could do if he hears you." He, of course, was Storch. He had no patience for giggling, and even less for Theo himself. Eliza's worst nightmare was that Storch would sell Theo, just like he'd sold Eliza's husband, Gregory, a few months before Nate arrived. Eliza rarely talked about Gregory, and it hurt her too much, Nate knew. But she told Nate a few things about her husband, that he was joyful like Theo and he had those same bright eyes, that not 1 hour went by without her missing him. What a fool Nate was, getting Theo all riled up. Luckily, Storch was probably too busy cursing George Washington to notice Theo's giggles. "Mama," Theo said very quietly, "I pilot." Eliza's eyes softened and she and Nate shared a smile. "Even pirates have to be quiet," Eliza said, kissing Theo's nose, "or they get in trouble." Storch's voice bellowed from the house. "Cake!" "I'll keep this pirate out of trouble," Nate promised. Eliza rushed inside to serve Storch and his friend. Theo put his face close to Nate's. "Tell a pirate story," Theo begged. "Tell about Slash." Slash was Slash O'Shea, the greatest living pirate. Nate had grown up hearing Papa's stories about Slash, and Nate had shared most of them with Theo. Slash got his name from the dagger strapped to his stump where his hand used to be. Some pirates were nothing more than low-life thieves. They captured ships and stole everything they could. They murdered anyone who got in their way. Not Slash. He'd never killed a man. And he gave some of his treasure away, mostly to orphans. He'd sneak into cities disguised in ragged beggars' clothes and hand out gold coins to kids living on streets. "I'll tell you a Slash story later," said Nate. "How about a song?" A grin spread across Theo's face. He loved when Nate sang shanties, the song sailors crooned as they did their work. Nate sang Theo one of his papa's favorites, and then the sun rising up over the sea. Soon enough, Theo's eyes were closed. Nate gently pried the stick sword from Theo's hand. He lifted his little friend up and carried him to the soft patch of grass. Then Nate went back to his weeds and worms. Storch and Martson had finished their cake and were puffing on cigars. They were still talking about the war. "Don't worry, my friend. This war will be over soon," Storch was saying. "The king sent hundreds of ships. The big battle is coming any day. Washington and his army of traitors will soon be crushed." Martson nodded his face generally in agreement. Nate didn't pay much attention to the war. He understood what it was about, whether the 13 American colonies would stay part of England or if they would become a new country of their own. He remembered the late-night talks on Papa's ships. Nate would lie in his hammock and listen to Papa and his men griping about England and King George. There was no mention of war back then. Most of the men were proud that America was part of England and the most powerful country on earth. But they hated paying so many taxes, that extra money that England made the colonists pay when they bought things like tea and paper. They started to see King George as a bully who didn't care about the people who lived in the colonies. Go get you something. Their fiery discussions would last deep into the night. Nate would struggle to stay awake, and he never wanted to miss a word of what they were saying. But now, Nate didn't care about King George. It didn't matter to him who won the war. Whatever happened, he was pretty sure Eliza and Theo would still be slaves. Papa would still be gone, and Nate would be stuck here, pulling up Storch's weeds. Nate stopped listening to Storch and Martson. Time crawled by, the front door banged open, and Mr. Martson walked out waiting to his waiting carriage. Storch stood outside and waved goodbye as he puffed on his cigar. It was right then that Nate realized that Theo wasn't asleep in the grass anymore. Nate scanned the yard until he spotted that little boy. He was next to the house, just a few yards from Storch. Theo had found a new pirate sword, an enormous stick almost as big as he was. He was spinning around like a top. The stick whipped around him. Storch had his back turned and he couldn't see Theo. Just then Theo stumbled. The stick slipped from his hand and it flew surprisingly fast like a spear, and it was heading right toward Storch's head. Nate's heart stopped. He opened his mouth to scream out a warning, but it was too late. Thwack! The stick smashed Storch right in the back of his head. He cursed in pain, and then Nate's uncle fell to the ground like an empty sack. So we will read on chapter 4 tomorrow. So just answer the questions that are in